So I've tested Wriothesley in nearly every way possible, and in today's video we're going to be going in depth with everything regarding Wriothesley, including his kit, builds, teams, etc. But before we get into that, let's first talk about his strengths and weaknesses as a unit. One of Wriothesley's main strengths is how well he scales with investment. Things like artifacts, weapons, and even his constellations help him greatly in dealing damage. His most notable investment is his Constellation 1, which not only increases his overall damage output, but essentially makes his Ascension 1 passive basically more usable. And because he is a hyper carry unit, such investment is very valuable for units like him. And while maybe in the early stages you may not notice his performance being that well, over time he'll end up doing really good damage and overall be an asset that you will value greatly on your account if you do enjoy playing him. Another strength is him being a cryo unit. Now being cryo essentially allows him to be relatively flexible with the team archetypes that he can play in, because he can play in things like melt, he can also be in freeze, he can also work as a hyper carry, and because of all these flexible team archetypes, this makes him relatively flexible alongside being future proof, which means that future supports like any power supports, hydra supports, or off-field applicators will more than likely work with him. It also helps that he is a normal attack-based character, meaning that in terms of limitations, he actually isn't that limited with how many characters he can use, in comparison to someone like Neuvillette, for example, who is a charge attack-based DPS and may not work with every single character. Wriothesley is overall a very easy character to build and play, because you really only need to build him on Marchasi Hunter, and then in terms of just artifacts and playstyle, you can pretty much most of the time just NA spam, or you need to do one or two specific combos for things like reverse melt. But outside of that, he really doesn't have any demand for high mechanical play, which also is very nice to have for someone, especially people who are like on mobile or other devices who may not have the luxury of being on PC. Wriothesley is a very single target oriented character, and he works really well in single target or in scenarios where there is 2 or 3 enemies. Because he is a normal attack based character and a lot of his strength comes from his normal attacks, he doesn't really require any energy recharge because his burst is sort of like a side piece to his kit. It's very similar to Wanderer, where you can pretty much use it every other rotation, or you can just literally never use it at all. And of course, because his normal attacks are infused with cryo due to him being a catalyst user, this makes him pretty much the king of ice bridging, because you can literally just spam normal attacks and you will unironically ice bridge forever. Now let's get into some of his weaknesses. Now, as I mentioned before, his Constellation 1 is a really good investment upgrade for Wriothesley, and especially for people who enjoy Wriothesley. However, one of the points that I mentioned is that it does basically make his Ascension 1 passive usable, which at C0, his Ascension 1 passive, while it is usable, it's more effective at that point to just run a healer or a pseudo healer, because you can only use his charge attack on average twice per rotation, and the healing isn't enough to make him HP positive. Characters like Neuvillette and Linny, for example, can very easily sustain themselves even at C0, but with Wriothesley, at C0, he ends up actually losing more HP than he does gaining HP, and this is because his Ascension 1 passive at C0 only heals 30% of his max HP. And while this is nice for things like when you're using Flowing Purity for the Bond of Life, if you're genuinely trying to run Wriothesley in a non-healer team and run him as like a hyper carry or some other team archetype that doesn't necessarily need or use a healer, you're probably going to struggle unless you're using something like a shielder to protect him. So overall, his lack of self-sustain pre-C1 is very underwhelming, and honestly pretty much just makes an entire passive of his just relatively useless. It also doesn't help that his C1 also boosts the damage on the charge attack and allows him to do it more frequently, which also inherently increases his damage potential, and it's basically just a well-bait constellation at that point. Because Wriothesley is also a hyper carry unit, of course, as I mentioned before, investing in him more and more is only going to make him better, but of course, when you don't invest into him that well, obviously he's probably going to struggle with performing. And that's of course just simply the nature of hyper carry units, is that investing in them and giving them as high quality of materials and upgrades as possible is very vital for their performance, and so when you don't do that, they're probably going to feel more lackluster than you expect. Another thing to consider, which I didn't really know whether to label this as like a weakness or something just to point out, but it's mainly his normal attacks actually, and this is in regards to the hit lag on his normal attacks, because his normal attacks actually have a considerable amount of hit lag, and this makes things like trying to run attack speed buffers like Mika or Yunjin a little bit more difficult and less valuable to do because of how much there is. Alongside this, when you're fighting smaller enemies, like for example in Floor 12 Chamber 2 first half against the Vishaps, you'll notice that a lot of the times he actually staggers them and it it ends up just creating a dilemma where you're trying to control where you're attacking them. And if you're especially playing a character like Bennett in Melt, you're going to notice that they're just going to end up outside of the Bennett radius, and most of the time, instead of actually being able to excel with your combo, most of the time you're actually going to end up focusing on trying to just make sure that you're staying within the Bennett radius, and it can get kind of annoying in situations like that. And the last point is that he generally struggles in very large AoE situations unless you have a crowd control character or someone that has really sufficient AoE application. And even then, Wriothesley just in and of himself isn't necessarily a character that you're going to pick if you're trying to clear large AoE content very effectively. Wriothesley highly prefers situations where there's not as many enemies and he can just lock onto certain targets, which allows him to do his normal attack spam with ease. So you'll notice within the strengths and weaknesses section that I actually put a little bit of emphasis in regards to the conversation about his Constellation 1. And this generally has raised the question, especially during his pre-release, on whether or not you need his Constellation 1 to perform. And the answer is of course no. As somebody who has C0 Wriothesley and has been playing him now since literally day 1, I can confidently say that at C0 I'm personally satisfied with his performance. His Constellation 1 is literally nowhere near necessary to perform. His Constellation 1 is somewhat similar to Hu Tao's, where the main thing about his C1 is the amount of quality of life it brings, although what makes it different from Hu Tao's C1 is that it completely opens access to an entire passive of his, because his Ascension 1 passive, as I mentioned before, isn't as accessible at C0 as it is at C1, because at C1 you can get it every 5th normal attack and it's on a 2.5 second cooldown, whereas at C0 you can only generally do it twice per rotation, and the cooldown is once every 5 seconds, and on top of that, at C1 the damage bonus is greater than it is at C0, which means you'll benefit more from the charge attacks, and then implicitly you'll also be ending up doing more damage per rotation on average. And while this is fine for it to be an upgrade for a C1, the problem is that it's very clearly problematic and very cash grabby in nature, and I think that is a completely justifiable point to make. However, it's also important to make sure that we're not overemphasizing its value and saying things like you need Wriothesley C1 for him to perform, because that is just completely untrue and very disingenuous in nature. So if you enjoy Wriothesley and you really think that you're going to play him for a really long time, or you have the amount of primitives to spend more on him, then I would say it is worth it to get his C1. However, it is not a necessity. Running him at C0 with regular weapons or whatever is just fine to clear floor 12 Abyss content. You do not need C1 to clear floor 12. That is just obnoxious and ridiculous. So now that we have that covered, let's now get on to some tips regarding Wriothesley. So the first tip is in regards to his Ascension 1 passive. Now you'll notice that once you're below 60% HP, you will start to have a red aura. And actually right before that aura, you'll actually see a symbol pop up first before the aura emits around him, helping players to indicate when you can use his charge attack to heal him. This is very useful, especially in situations where there's a lot of combat. Maybe you're not paying too much attention to when you can use it, but with the mark alongside the aura, it is very noticeable and very easy to see. So now tips regarding his attack string. So when it comes to things like canceling, jump canceling will interrupt his attack string. However, when you do dash cancels or you cast your elemental skill mid-combo, it actually will not interrupt his attack string. Now I know there's been bugs and stuff regarding this and they're patching it soon, so I'm not really going to address that. I'm just going to be speaking straightforwardly about these mechanics. So being able to dash cancel and use his skill without interrupting his attack string actually opens the door for being able to take advantage of this in situations like reverse melt, which I will get into in a second in his combo section. The last tip is that you can use normal attacks or his elemental burst to actually position enemies properly. So of course the poise damage that I mentioned earlier, while it can be annoying in situations where smaller enemies can get staggered, you can actually use this to your advantage to position them either closer together or position them in places that you want them to be. And of course this can be an upside or a downside depending on the situation. You can also use his elemental burst to trigger certain enemy movements. So for example, in floor 12, chamber 3 in the first half, if you notice the Fatui on the opposite ends, you can actually use his burst and it'll drag the one on the opposite end immediately straight to the character's location, which makes it fairly easy to clear that floor. Moving on to his combos, before I actually talk about his combos, something that I do want to note is that his normal attacks have normal ICE, meaning that it works in a once every 2.5 second interval in terms of reactions or once every 3 hits. So that's something to take into consideration as I'm talking talking about these combo strings. So the first thing to talk about is doing NA spam. Now doing NA spam is fine across pretty much every team archetype. However, in things like Melt, if you do use his normal attack spam, most of the time your first normal attack and your fourth normal attack are melting. Now it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not as valuable because you really don't want your N4 to melt because of its motion value being relatively low, and you normally want your fifth hit to be melting because it has its highest damage scaling up there. So in melt teams, there are various ways to achieve this, or at least get consistent melts that are really good. So the first combo is doing an N4 skip. And what this means is you do 3 normal attacks, and then once you're about to do your 4th normal attack, you can do a dash cancel, and then you do your 5th attack. And this allows your 5th hit to melt pretty much every single time. However, this can be a little bit tricky, and in practice, this can be a little bit inconvenient in certain domains. So there's another way to do this where you do your first normal attack, then you cast your skill, and then you continue to normal attack spam. Not only is this way easier, but this allows your N3 and N5 to consistently melt over an entire rotation. Now outside of those combos, the last combo I want to mention is doing 3 normal attacks and then a charge attack. This string helps with maintaining his HP a little bit more because you're not doing as many normal attacks to drain his HP. However, this will drain more stamina over time, but nonetheless, this performs relatively decently, and you can use this combo as well if you want to. So really quickly, let's get onto building Wriothesley. So I'm personally going to talk about what I build on Wriothesley. When it comes to pretty much every single team archetype, for the most part, you can just simply run Wriothesley Hunter and you can do attack, crowd damage, and crit. Or if you don't have a good crit piece, there's actually situations like for me, for example, where I use an attack circlet with decent crit stats. And you could do something like this as well, and I still have pretty decent performance with him. If you're running him in something like Freeze, then 4-piece Blizzard Destroyer may actually be better in some situations, especially if you have better stats on that set, then generally it's better to go that. And if you have neither of those sets, then something like 4-piece Shimenawas or Gladiators or any attack-based set pretty much will just work fine. So now let's get onto weapons. Now in this section, I'm mainly only going to talk about weapons that I have used and played around with. I'm not going to speak for things like his best in slot, yada yada yada, just because I haven't used them and I don't really want to speak on that experience. I'm going to speak as somebody with Caesar or Wriothesley and who has a few 5 stars, but otherwise mainly just 4-star, generally more accessible options. So Kagura's Verity is meh. It's honestly simply a stat stick, and even then it ends up getting surpassed by Woodsith. I just have better performance on this weapon than I even do on this 5-star. So literally just leave this on Yaimiko or whoever can actually use the weapon's passive. Next up is Skyward Atlas. Now I actually really like using this weapon. However, of course I switched to Woodsith simply because I just got an attack percent circlet and the crit stats just aren't good enough for me to be using this weapon in comparison to this one. Alongside the fact that I use him more in melt teams, and because I can take advantage of every passive in Woodsith in melt teams, I just don't really use this one as often anymore, but I might switch back to this once I get better artifact stats and more crit stats that can make this a bit more viable, but until then, it's whatever. But overall, the performance when I was using this before was actually really good, and I feel really satisfied when I use this weapon. So if you have this is also a decent option to use. The event mode was actually really nice to use, and the passive was really helpful when I was using him in the testing. So overall, if this is all you have, or if you don't want to craft Flowing Purity, then I would say this is a nice weapon to use. Do not use Solar Pearl unless you are able to consistently burst every single rotation, which, let's be for real, most of the time you're not unless you have a lot of Favonius procs or you have a ton of energy built into him for whatever reason. This passive is just not that synergistic with him, and even if you gain the passive, you only gain it for 6 seconds, while if you take into context his skill state is 10 seconds, so you only really generally have a little over half uptime with the buff on this anyways. So overall, while it's a decent stat stick if it's all you have, it's just not something that I would prefer you to select over other options. Woodsith is a generally nice option, especially if you're primarily going to use him in melt. Then I would say if you have this at R3 or higher, then just use it. Really good crit damage stat. Although lower base attack, it's not the worst thing in the world, and all the passives can be beneficial in melt teams. However, outside of melt, you of course then lose out on the Elemental Mastery incentive, and at that point it's a 2 in 3 chance of it being useful, which in some runs can feel a little bit lackluster, but otherwise it's whatever. Now while I don't have Flowing Purity on my account, I will actually opt to speak on this because I do have it on another account where I play other characters that can use the weapon, and I also have a little bit of a better understanding with how that weapon works in general, so I will still somewhat speak on it. Now keep in mind that Wriothesley's charge attack on his Ascension 1 passive heals him for 30% of his max HP, while the Bond of Life takes 24%. So Wriothesley by himself can pretty much clear the Bond of Life stack and he can overall get near or oftentimes the entire maximum stack that you can get from the Flowing Purity elemental damage bonus. And the elemental damage bonus from the initial part of the passive and from clearing the Bond of Life, plus the fact that it gives an attack percent substat with a high base attack, also makes it a very competitive option even with Wriothesley, and especially if you have lower refinements on Wriothesley. I would then say you can actually craft an R5 Flowing Purity and it will probably outperform a Wriothesley at lower refinements. So now let's get on to team building. Now when it comes to team building, let's first go over some synergies as well as anti-synergies. Wriothesley is a normal attack based crowd damage unit, so any character that buffs normal attack damage, gives damage percent buffs, or any resistance shred will be really useful to him. So characters like Shenhe, Yunjin, Yelan, or any anime units like Kazuha, Sucrose, or Heijo will work really well with him. Now at C0, he'll especially love some defensive utility like in healing or in shielding, so characters like Bennett, Baiju, Jin or Sayu, Kukishinobu, Mika or Diona in the cryo position, or Zhongli and Layla are just some of many units that you can use to pair with him in certain team archetypes. And lastly, any off-field units or normal attack based units or sub-DPS characters will also work well with him, so characters like Jiangling, Zinshou, and as I mentioned before, Yelan will also work pretty decently with him. So now let's get on to anti-synergies. So Wriothesley, as I mentioned very early on, is a hypercarry unit that likes to have a lot of on-field time. So you do not want to be pairing him with other hypercarries or other units that demand a decent amount of on-field time as well, because it's just basically counterintuitive to his entire gameplay and just not that great. Another thing is attack speed buffers. Now in some situations he can be synergistic with them, but in a lot of scenarios it's actually not as great. As I mentioned before, it's because of the hit lag on his normal attacks, which overall lowers its value. However, in scenarios where a hypercarry team can work and the hit lag isn't that bad, then it can be usable, but otherwise overall it's not as valuable as in comparison to the other units that I mentioned above in the synergy section. And lastly is any Electro unit. Superconduct is a reaction that's just irrelevant to him, and unless you're playing him in a very weird burn overload type thing, which I don't even think is something that many have really experimented with, and I don't think really needs experimentation because it's probably not going to be that amazing. It's just weird. Unless you're doing something like in Hyperbloom, most Electro units aren't necessarily going to be something that you want to completely look for when you're trying to pair units with Wriothesley, because they just don't work in tandem with him. Of course, I could be completely wrong about this. However, I'm simply basing this off the fact that I actually have tested things like Melt Overload and stuff like, I've tested weird stuff in regards to Electro, and I just personally felt that it wasn't as worth it as just simply running a regular Melt team. So now onto his main team archetypes. So the first is Reverse or Burn Melt. Now this involves Wriothesley, Bennett, any pyro applicator or application form, and then a flex slot. So an example of a Melt team is something like this, where you have Wriothesley, Bennett, Jiangling, and Sucrose, and I have Sucrose in this team on Thrilling Tales, which I can give to Jiangling for more damage, and then of course Wriothesley can melt most of the hits consistently. You can also do something like Burn Melt, where you do something like Nahida, Bennett, Toma, with Nahida's strong Dendra application allowing for burning to consistently trigger, which helps with Wriothesley's melt capabilities. And because of the burning side reaction, this also helps with making sure that Toma isn't the one melting and it's actually Wriothesley melting. And of course Bennett is here for extra particle generation, which helps with Toma's energy needs, alongside providing some more defensive utility through healing and an attack buff. Now if you're someone like me that has a high invested side unit like Kazuha for example, and I have my Kazuha on Constellation 2, which if you don't know, increases the elemental mastery of both Kazuha and characters within his elemental burst field, which is really useful in teams like Melt. So you can of course opt to run this form of Kazuha in something like a Burn Melt team. However, I also think that it's a little bit better to do it in something like with Shenhe, like this, where you run double cryo with Bennett Kazuha, or you can also do it in something like this where it's Bennett Jiangling in Kazuha. Now next up is mono cryo and freeze teams. Now this consists of Wriothesley, a cryo unit that's usually an off-fielder, a buffer, or some form of a healer, an animo unit for resistance shred or any other supportive capabilities that they provide, and a hydro slot, which can either be an off-field trigger or an applicator like say Kokomi or Yelan. One of the main ones that I use is Wriothesley, Shenhe, Kazuha, and Yelan. I just really like this team, and although it is healerless and I do have him at C0, I do not find myself in many situations where I'm really struggling to make sure that he's not dying. So overall, I like this team, but of course, if you prefer to have some form of healing or more defensive utility, you can swap Shunha for something like Mika or Diona, or if you don't want to swap Shunha, you can also swap Shunha for another sub DPS like Kaya or Rosaria. Or let's say you have Wriothesley, Shunha, Kazuha, and you want your Hydro to be the healer, then you can do either Zincho for his pseudo healing, or you can do Kokomi. Now next up is Hyperbloom. This is a pretty straightforward team. Wriothesley is mainly just here to act as an on-field unit, and while it can generate some more bloom cores, it's just Hyperbloom. So I mean, there's nothing complicated or anything unique about this team. It's just really Hyperbloom, and the damage is less focused on Wriothesley and more on the Hyperbloom core damage. But nonetheless, it's still a team that you can use. And in this team, I would prefer that you use Kikushinobu over something like Raiden Shogun for more defensive utility. But if you have him at C1 and above, or you think at C0, Zincho's healing is fine enough in the situation that you're using him in, then you can just use Zincho and use like Raiden Shogun instead. So now really quickly, I want to introduce a relatively niche team that has been mentioned pretty frequently for a while now. I personally first heard it from Zajef, and Yelan is in spot for Farina here, but it's basically supposed to be Wriothesley, Farina, Baizhu, and Xiangling. And I actually tried this team with Yelan as a substitute, and surprisingly, it actually performed pretty decently. It was kind of weird to experience, and I really don't know how to describe what's happening a lot of the time. All I really can say about at least this variation of this team is that it works. Of course, it's not the best, and one of the downsides is the energy requirements. You're probably going to need a decent amount of energy in pretty much all of these characters, especially Xiangling, because she doesn't have Bennett to alleviate her energy needs. So you're definitely going to need some ER on her. But outside of that, this team performs relatively well. You have Xiangling's Pyronado damage, you have Baizhu with healing and defensive utility. Yelan is in place for Farina, but I would assume Farina is going to be mainly here for, of course, her supportive capabilities. But in the case where Yelan is here, she provides the damage ramping buff from her Ascension passive alongside some off-field application, and then Wriothesley, of course, as your main on-field DPS. Alright, so that about covers everything for this. So to end off this Wriothesley comprehensive guide, I'm now going to show you an in-game demonstration of one of his teams. For this Abyss demonstration, we're going to be doing this in floor 12 in the first chamber against the boss in the first half. And the team that I'm going to be demonstrating is Wriothesley in a melt team with Bennett, Xiangling, and Sucrose. I especially like this team because Sucrose runs Thrilling Tales with the Verdescent Venera shred, alongside the fact that her elemental mastery buff from her burst and just her swirls is really nice. Xiangling, of course, with the constant off-field power application and damage, and she'll get the Thrilling Tales damage buff, which increases her damage by a lot. Bennett is going to be running 4-piece Noblesse, and of course we have Wriothesley as our main on-fielder, and then I'm going to be primarily doing his N1 then E normal attack spam combo. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and until the next video, bye bye.